All right, we now want to move on and have that particular discussion which we had hinted earlier on. I'm now joined in studio by Daniel Clement, who's a senior fellow and director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He's also an expert in Asia-Pacific strategy with a particular focus on the U.S. competition with China, rather. Many thanks for making time and welcome to KTN.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
All right. Now, I think we should delve deeper into the Belt and Road Initiative. We have a majority of African countries which are directly involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, and borrowing from the forum that was held in April of this year, where China was actually gathering world leaders for that particular forum. On the surface, it looks like China is promoting a mere connected world through Chinese funded infrastructure, be it digital, be it infrastructural as well. But questions have arisen in terms of the countries, developing countries, actually seeking funds from China. Are these countries biting more than they can chew? I think that's a good place to start.
So when we at CNAS did the study looking at the 10 cases that you just reviewed, we found that a number of countries ultimately had projects that were very problematic for some of the reasons that you've described, whether it was unsustainable financing, negative environmental impacts, or even potential for corruption. And I think what we found was countries need to ask the right questions as they evaluate these deals. That if they are asking, for example, is this financially sustainable? Is the deal transparent? Is it corruption resistant? They could engage China on their terms, but too often China took advantage.
All right. Now, delving deeper into some of the key issues you highlighted in the report, took off the unsustainable financial burdens. We have developing countries who are looking to expand infrastructure-wise and also invest in order to, benefit themselves in future. But in terms of asking questions centered around the financial burdens, is this a problem going forth in terms of the benefits vis-a-vis the negative side of this particular loans and commitments they have with China?
It's a great question. My perspective is that to ensure financing is fair, countries need to ensure there are alternatives to China. And in a number of these cases, the bidding was opaque, non-transparent. Often there wasn't an alternative explored. And so you saw China sometimes run up the cost in ways that were deeply problematic for the country. So I think ultimately, to get the right financing, there should be many countries all competing for these projects, and that will ensure that the recipient state gets the best deal possible.
All right. Now in terms of financing, we well know that developing countries might not have the proper financial weight to approach certain institutions. Talk about the IMF. We also have African countries going on record saying that perhaps going to the West, they might be needed to, do a little bit more, but China seems to be a little bit lenient in terms of the discussions on the table. Now, this was highlighted due to the unwillingness of financing developing countries due to tough measures that might be put in place in accessing funds, hence they're turning to the East. But in terms of the liabilities to these host countries, let's just delve deeper into the debt factor, because it's been a big issue, not just here in Kenya, but some of the other over 30 countries in Africa that are actively engaged with the China Belt and Road Initiative. In terms of the debt burden, what do you think about it?
Sure. So I'll speak to our study at CNAS, which was global. The debt burden, I would say, manifested in a few ways. In some countries, China added debt to what already existed, and you saw the kind of risk of financial distress. And Ecuador was a really interesting example where China's debt, or the debt owed to China, is so high that Ecuador now has to repay Beijing in oil, sort of a neo-colonial arrangement. In other cases, you didn't see this kind of overarching financial risk, but that there were massive cost overruns. So a Chinese company might come in, bid pretty low, but over time, the cost of the project would get higher and higher. And this was, for example, in the case of Indonesia, where the high-speed railway has encountered a lot of setbacks that China undertook. So there's different types of, I would say, financial burdens that have been incurred.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Now, in terms of the significant potential for corruption, I think we have to delve deeper into this. As a country, we're also pushing the fight against corruption. But when we see such a report and we're actively involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, it raises questions because payoffs to politicians and bureaucrats might be a thing that is happening. In your report, you highlighted this. Just help us understand this potential threat in terms of corruption and the significance it might have going forward with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Absolutely. So in the cases that we studied, corruption took a number of forms. Sometimes it was allegations of bribery of senior officials, like occurred in Ecuador. One case that we did not look at, but had very clear instances of corruption, was Sri Lanka, where essentially there was a payoff of the then prime minister. I think the key takeaway was in all these places where you saw corruption occur, that there wasn't necessarily kind of a powerful media spotlight. And to me, I mean, the key takeaway from our study was the importance of having, whether it was a vibrant media to kind of pull this out, or civil society and strong governance. And so, as you said, looking forward, to me, it puts that weight on having a vibrant media and good governance, and essentially constraining China's ability to engage in these types of corrupt practices.
All right. Now, in terms of disengagement from local economic needs, looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, most Chinese firms use China's for their labor in terms of the constructions that is going on in infrastructure as compared to local workers. We have more Chinese workers on board in these initiatives. Now, this might raise questions in terms of the profit-sharing agreements, don't you think?
Definitely. The use of Chinese labor was actually only one piece of that disengagement from local economic needs that we identified. There were some other instances where, for example, infrastructure designed potentially for China, but not the local economy. So we looked at Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands, where China built a wharf that was big enough to dock an aircraft carrier at a location that saw maybe 1 or 2 cruise ships a month, if that. In Hungary, a railway that essentially is running to a Chinese-owned port, Piraeus, but actually that's not the most profitable route. So again, designed for Chinese exports into Europe. So it's certainly the Chinese use of China's labor is one piece of it, but it's also kind of the larger, is this infrastructure actually designed to sort of maximize local development, or does it serve another purpose?
Now, it's well known that this is our trade route, and I think as Africa, we're caught in the middle. Let me just expound further to the US-China trade wars right now, because there are continents that are caught in the middle in terms of that particular trade war. Let's delve deeper into that. As you're coming from the Institute and you've done your research, what do you think about the US-China trade war in terms of the catastrophe that might happen to other countries that are actively involved with either the West or the East?
It's a great question. So I think actually this type of competition is going to, over the long term, help third countries a great deal. Whether it's with Belt and Road, and you see the United States, Japan, India, Europe trying to do more in developing countries to invest and build infrastructure. But on the trade issue in particular, I think there's certainly going to be short-term turbulence. But already you see many companies, not only in the US, but Europe and elsewhere, rethinking their supply chains in China and looking to move factory production out to other locations. So far, I think Southeast Asia has benefited from it, but you could definitely imagine a world in which Africa becomes also a more prominent source of global supply chains, as many companies are looking to move outside of China.
All right. Now, in terms of the soft power tactics used by China, I mean, we have some state-funded projects, such as, out of my head, the Confucius Institute, which is working to export Chinese culture and history to academic communities abroad. Is such a move, the soft power tactics, a reason for concern for various countries?
The challenge to me is when soft power turns into sharp power. So certainly if there are opportunities for students to learn Chinese at university, that's a good opportunity. But what I've seen in certain countries is that you have, for example, Confucius Institutes and funding put pressure on professors to self-censor their own opinions about China's human rights practices, for example. So I think if the sort of true mission is purely cultural, that's a good thing. But if there's a political agenda that includes essentially censoring criticism of China, that would be problematic.
That would be problematic. Now, I think also the lack of transparency has been highlighted in the report, where some projects feature opaque, bidding processes to these contracts. Now, it is not well known how the negotiation went on, but we well know that China might have a bigger stake in negotiating with certain developing countries when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. What insights might you highlight in terms of the negative attributes that might be fronted in terms of this opaque, discussions that happen on board?
Sure. So there's, of course, concerns about China seeking to acquire access or control over strategic locations and what kind of clauses might be in some of these contracts. I think the bigger issue is that publics have a right, whether it's China, the United States, Europe, India, Japan, to understand if there's a large project that's going to use public funds, to understand what's in that contract, what are the terms, what are the implications for a country's long-term future. And so, to me, that's the issue. It's information that publics have the right to know with China or with anyone else.
All right. Now, in terms of the geopolitical risks, we well know that this might be a push to actually cement China's influence in the world. But the geopolitical risk we're taking a look at might actually pose a big challenge, because it might compromise the recipient's state telecommunications infrastructure and place the companies or the countries at the center of strategic competition, between other great powers and China as well. Geopolitical risks, what are we looking at there?
So geopolitical risks, you flagged rightly the concern about telecommunications security, that any company in China, based on Chinese law, has to furnish up information to the central government. So no matter what the company says, if pushed, it has no recourse but to give data of anyone to the Chinese government. And so there's a basic issue of just your information security. For certain countries, it's an issue of becoming, I would say, becoming in the middle of great power competition. So one port that we looked at was in Burma, a port that became of high concern to India as well as the United States, that China might use it militarily. So Burma suddenly in this jockeying of great powers. Argentina, another example, has a space center that is actually run by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China. Argentina probably never expected that it would be in the midst of US-China strategic competition, but today it is. So I think it's countries finding themselves in an uncomfortable position, and the risks attendant with that.
Talking about uncomfortable positions, the bad debt issue has been raised a couple of times, and I'm keen to find your views about it in terms of the developing countries, sourcing for money from the East. But in terms of paying back, it might be a little bit too much for these developing countries, looking at the economic impact of these infrastructural projects, the digital projects, now vis-a-vis the money that they will get from this particular projects and pay back to the Chinese. Now, bad debts issue has been raised time and time again. What's your issue on this, especially in developing countries, as you've highlighted Ecuador? I think we could also take a look at some African countries as well.
I think the concerns about certainly large amounts of debt are well known, and the kind of impact it can have on a country's economic future. You spoke about China's digital investments, and I actually want to go into a little bit more detail there, because I think it's important to understand, with all infrastructure, there's potentially a financial risk of debt, but with the digital infrastructure, beyond the kind of security issues that we discussed, certainly if you sit in a democracy, there are concerns about China exporting elements of its own domestic surveillance complex. So not only through technology, but also through know-how and capability, and in a sense, kind of pushing foreign governments that are democratic to maybe move in a more autocratic direction through the use of technology. So I would say debt is certainly concerning, but if we're forward-looking, I think that what at CNAS we like to call high-tech liberalism, and China kind of spinning out aspects of its autocratic system is quite concerning.
All right. Now, as we conclude, I think just taking a look at the environmental impacts, it might be a negative in that particular case, because the environmental assessments might not be adequately done, and this might end up causing severe environmental damage in respect to the infrastructure development that is happening in various countries. What's your take on that?
So certainly in our study, in a number of cases, you did see environmental damage occur. To me, it gets back to the fact that for all of these types of big infrastructure projects, there needs to be a healthy competition among many countries, not just China alone bidding. And that ultimately, I mean, countries as well as civil society, the press, should hold China to a high set of expectations that it would hold any other country. And so to me, that ultimately is the crux, that if there's a healthy competition, hopefully we won't see these types of problems in the future.
And as we conclude the national sovereignty issue, I just want to take a look at this because talk about long-term leases or multi-decade operating contracts. What negative effects might this bring in terms of erosion to national sovereignty?
Certainly, I mean, in some cases like Argentina, I mean, the Argentinian government doesn't have easy access to this facility on its territory, where literally they can't sort of walk in and see the facility on a day-to-day basis. In other cases, again, I think it exposes countries to the risk of being caught up in strategic competition if they have to worry that China will push for military access one day on their soils. So again, I think it comes down to if countries can create a healthy competition, they're much better positioned to engage China on their own terms and protect their sovereignty.
All right. Now, as we conclude, perhaps a final statement from you in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. When it comes to the table, is it a good thing or a bad thing? We well know everything has its positives and negatives, but as you did your report and you got to weigh the negatives and positives, what do you make of the Belt and Road Initiative as of now?
So ultimately, the Belt and Road very much serves to advance China's vision for international order in the 21st century. I think that vision is pretty different from that of many countries, a return to kind of great power spheres of influence, certainly state-driven economic interactions, and a kind of ascendant authoritarianism. So I think there are certainly upsides to Belt and Road for some developing countries, but only if they engage it on their own terms and are sure that there actually is a real competition for projects and not simply a vacuum in which China can kind of dictate the terms of these deals. All
right, so engaging in their own terms and competition is very important in the success of the Belt and Road Initiative. Daniel Clement, many thanks for making time. He's a senior fellow and director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, also an expert at Asia Pacific strategy with particular focus on the U.S. competition with China. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, let's take a short break right here in Bottom Line Africa. We'll be back with more information for you. We'll leave you with Destination Africa.